Good afternoon. It's my privilege also to welcome you to this gender unit book discussion. We are very privileged to have two esteemed colleagues, Adriaan van Klinken from Leeds University, and then Ashwin Tyson, who is a PhD student. Also came through the MTH Gender and Health, but is currently a PhD student also in systematic theology, working also on queer anthropology, so an African queer anthropology, so which is very interesting. And then, so Adriaan van Klinken, I will sort of introduce, but we're here to discuss his book, Kenyan Christian Queer, which was published last year, and has been made also in a documentary. So we just said sort of he's living every writer's dream to have a book and a movie. So we are very excited to also hear about that. But yeah, so before I give over to Ashwin, who will be the conversation leader, and also after his questions that he will ask Adriaan, we'll give some time for conversation. You are then allowed, we ask that you can either raise your hand or in the chat box, type your question if you prefer to do that, and he will then moderate the conversation from that point onwards. Just before I introduce Adriaan formally, also thank you so much also to Dion Foster, who's the director of the Beyersnudie Center, and then also Marita Snyman for also taking care of all the arrangements. It's really been wonderful, working with you in this regard. So Adriaan van Klinken originates from the Netherlands, where he studied theology and religious studies at Utrecht University, and also did his doctorate there. As an MA student at Utrecht, he also was a visiting student to UKZN, and I think that's sort of his interest in South Africa started in 2006. And then also he's been in Stellenbosch at STIAS, where he spent a sabbatical in 2016. Upon completing his PhD in 2011, Adriaan was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of London, after which he was appointed at the University of Leeds. And early this year, he was promoted to the position of full professor of religion and African studies. So congratulations also on that.
Thank you.
Adriaan's research interests are in contemporary Christianity, gender and sexuality in Africa. He conducted extensive research on religion, men and masculinities, especially in Zambia. And that was his 2013 book, Transforming Masculinities in African Christianity. He then conducted research on religion and the politics of homosexuality in contemporary Africa, which resulted in 2 book volumes. He co-edited with Estra Chitando. And then in recent years, he conducted research on Christianity and Lgbt activism in Kenya, which is the result of the book we are discussing today. So we are really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much, Ashwin, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Prof. Julie. It's an absolutely amazing honor to share this space, this virtual space with Adriaan, with you, Professor Claessens, and also with the many lovely guests that we have. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Just before I forget, because Adriaan, as Prof. Claessens mentioned, has been rather busy with the writing of this book. So I'm sharing links now to the film that Professor Claessens mentioned, and then also a link to one of the songs that will be coming up in the questions. But before we get to the questions, I'd like to sort of set the stage on the conversation and how I read the book and how this plays a role in my life, and then from there we'll take the questions. So I read Kenyan Christian and Queer, this book. I read it in the crossover from completing my master's and on my way to the PhD. So last year my focus was on ecclesiology, particularly queering ecclesiology using the work of Bonhoeffer and how that may help with the queering ecclesiology. And then on my way to the PhD, I made my PhD focus is, as Professor Claessens mentioned, Black and queer theological anthropologies. And so this book was couched in between that period where I had just completed the master's and on the high of the thesis, and then on my way to, well, busy writing the proposal. So it really raised so many interesting questions on my own research and also the research that is to be done in Africa and African religiosity. So Adriaan's book is the reflection of genuine, I really truly believe this, genuine soulcraft. And the time, well, of course, anytime I read a text by Europeans about Africa, I'm extremely, extremely critical. However, superbly, in a very superb fashion, Adriaan's writing is not only recognizes the dignity of African people, but also celebrate queer Africans' courage. And I found that a very constant theme in the text, the celebration of the courage and of the brilliance of African people, Kenyans in particular in this situation. So the book is as intellectually stimulating as it is imaginatively titillating. It was truly a joy to read. So, well, on that note, I think if you are ready, Adriaan, we can go over to the questions.
I am more than ready for your questions, Ashwin. Let me just begin, if you allow me, to thank you for this very generous introduction to my book. I very much realize that I have a critical reader in you, and so your feedback and your positive appreciation of the book really, really means a lot. And I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to engage with you in a conversation about the book. Actually, it's only a year ago, I think, that we had an opportunity to start this conversation when I gave a lecture in Cape Town at the Desmond Tutu Center. So it's wonderful to have an opportunity to continue the conversation that we started at that time. Let me also make use of this opportunity to say thanks to express my thanks to Professor Claessens and Professor Foster, who took the initiative for setting up this presentation, which was supposed to take place earlier this year in Stellenbosch face-to-face. I was supposed to be in South Africa in March, but of course, a virus came into the world and all our plans kind of rapidly changed. But I am excited to have an opportunity to have this conversation virtually, which maybe is a good thing to do because it allows many more people to join who otherwise wouldn't have been able to be part of this. Many thanks also to Marita for the kind of practical and technical support for hosting this seminar. I have very good memories myself of the time I have spent in Stellenbosch and the visits to the university and the Faculty of Theology and my previous interactions with students and the faculty. So I'm really looking forward to not just engaging with you, Ashwin, but also with other students and colleagues and friends from other sections who have joined today.
Thank you so much. I was reminded now that you were writing this book while at STIAS, if I'm not wrong.
Part of it, yeah.
Yeah, so it's in a sense, as I said, a homecoming.
It's a baby that was born in produced in Stellenbosch.
So the first question would be, the style of this monograph is characteristically different than what would be a traditional work on religious studies or theology. Each chapter is followed by an interlude in which you engage reflexively. Who then would you say was your intended audience, given the form and style of your writing?
Thanks. That's a really interesting question. You are quite right that the style in which I wrote the book is quite different from, let's say, the average academic monograph. And I've always been kind of uncomfortable, I think, with academic books in which the author kind of is invisible from the text, is not present in the text, and in which, as a reader, you don't really get a sense of who the author is, how the knowledge that they present has been produced, and how it links to their own lives, to their own experiences, to their own embodied being. And I think this practice of the invisible kind of academic writer is particularly problematic, and it relates to a comment that you just made in your introduction, I think, in fields where the writer, the scholar, is based in the Euro-American Academy and is producing knowledge about subjects and people in other contexts, and in this case, in African contexts. Because such writing easily becomes kind of voyeuristic, especially when the topic, the subject of the book, is about issues of sexuality, about bodies, and about people's intimate lives. So for a long time, I've been kind of uncomfortable with that kind of way of academic writing, but I've always struggled to kind of come up with an alternative way of writing, because there is no clear example or a model that I could follow. So I had to kind of reinvent the wheel. And I think in the process of doing my research in Kenya, I realized that as much as I was asking questions from my research participants, members of the LGBT community in Kenya, and I learned about them, they also wanted to find out about me. And they asked questions about me, and they were interested in me in many different ways. And it made me kind of realize, methodologically speaking, that knowledge, academic knowledge, at least kind of knowledge that is produced in fieldwork, is only produced through relationships. So it is because of my relationships, because of my friendships that I was able to establish with my research participants in Kenya, that I was actually able to kind of access their experiences, their insights, their knowledge, and to kind of reproduce that in my own way. And it also made me realize that these kind of fieldwork relationships are not just formal. It is not just me as a researcher coming in, doing my stuff and going back home. But while I am in Kenya, I'm hanging out with these guys, I'm becoming friends with them. And when I leave the field and I'm back here in Leeds, I stay in contact with them, and they have become part of my life. So I think those kind of realizations make me think about what my research participants would make of my writing about them. And I wondered, would they recognize what I write about them? And would they recognize me? The kind of Adriaan that they get to know from me doing my fieldwork, is that the Adriaan that they sense in the text? Or when I write my text, do I become this kind of distant academic? So imagining my participants as possible readers is, I think, the response to your question. Because I started thinking about my research participants as possible readers, I decided that I wanted to write in an accessible way.
Okay.
And you are my judge. You can decide whether or not I manage to do that, but at least I try to do so, to avoid writing in this very kind of academic jargon, but also in what I would call a humanizing way, rendering my research participants human, but also rendering myself human and not just an academic.
I think that is profound. Thank you, because your book is quite accessible. Given my interest in queer theory and queer theology, I must be honest, queer theory is very difficult to read if one doesn't know philosophy, and your writing is exceptionally accessible. So that is you definitely achieved that goal. I think this therefore leads to the second question I have. So the second question is, in Interlude 2, Body Work, you wrote, and I quote, "Field work is an embodied activity, and the field is a site of desire and vulnerability, both physically and emotionally," end quote. The experiences you share are quite raw, they're very real. How did you navigate the space while honoring your participants? Your interludes were exceptionally well written because they were reflective of yourself, but also reflecting on your research participants in a way that really honors them. So how did you manage?
I mean, it has been quite a challenge and a really kind of complicated journey, and a very personal journey, to be honest. I think the experience of doing the research for this book was a very different one compared to my earlier research for my PhD and immediately as a postdoc, which I was doing in Zambia, where I was working in Pentecostal churches and in the Catholic Church in Zambia around issues of masculinity. At that time, I think I was able to kind of build good relationships with my participants, mostly young men, as we talked about their experiences of sexuality, of masculinity, and HIV, which was one of the kind of topics in my work at that time. However, while I was doing this research at that time in Zambia, I always had to hide an important part of myself, my own sexuality and my relationship status. So working in the context of churches where homosexuality was preached against all the time, how on earth could I tell to my participants that I am gay and that I'm in a relationship to, or actually married to another man? So I chatted and I hang out with my participants at that time. I did interviews with them, but I never became close at a kind of personal level. It always felt like, or at least that's how it felt for me. I could never be truly honest, because they would ask questions about my relationship and status and about my life, but I always had to come up with answers that kind of avoided those kind of questions. So when I started the research for my new book in Kenya, I was working with queer folk, and very soon, I think from the first week, basically, from that I was in Kenya, I realized that actually in my interactions with these guys that I came to know, I had nothing to hide. I befriended many of my participants and came quite close to a number of them at least. And as they shared their lives with me, and I shared my own life with them. So in the process of the research, and I spent in total around 6 months in Kenya, spread over different periods. We spent hours and hours in church, but also hours and hours in clubs and at parties. I honestly enjoyed the kind of culture of dancing, both in church and in clubs, and the culture of hugging and of flirtations in the field. But of course, this kind of asked new questions. What are my professional boundaries? And where do these boundaries actually come from? I mean, in kind of ethnographic research methods courses, as a researcher, you are being made aware, or as a student, you are being made aware of all the kind of conventions, the things you are supposed to do in the field and the things you are not supposed to do in the field, the things that are supposed to be ethical and the things that are supposed to be non-ethical. But what are the assumptions about fieldwork that underlie these kind of codes of research ethics? And what are the assumptions about the fieldwork relationships that are part of the research? And I think much of the academic literature about fieldwork is concerned with questions of power. And often the suggestion is that as a researcher, you are the one who holds power. So you come to the field and you bring power to the field. And of course, in my case, as a white, middle-class academic working at a British university, I come from a privileged background and I bring a lot of power to the field. But I also realized that in different ways, my research participants held power over me, and I was depending on them as much as I was in a relationship of power to them. So in several situations, I was vulnerable in my interactions with them, and I was depending on their goodwill and on their intentions. So this assumption that I am the one with power and over my research participants is at least kind of one-sided, is one of the things that I realized and started to reflect upon. Power in the field is not just one directional, but it comes from both directions, so to say. So the example I give in the book to kind of illustrate that point is where one of my research participants wanted to have sex with me. So just to be blunt, in a situation where I wasn't comfortable with that. And in a situation where I felt vulnerable in that specific context. So it made me think about my own vulnerability as much as about my own power. But in the book, or in that particular interlude where I discussed that example, I also write about another example. As much as I emphasize to my research participants that I am married and was trying to kind of manage their expectations about my availability, this did not stop some of them, at least, to express and to pursue an interest in me, directly or indirectly. And so I started to kind of navigate what I call in the book the kind of erotics of fieldwork, in which, as a researcher, I'm not only a kind of embodied researcher, but I'm also an object and a subject of desire. So how does desire work in fieldwork contexts? Which is a question that some anthropologists have written about, but in the field of religious studies or theology, that's not really... I wasn't aware of any work on that question and any kind of reflections on that question. So thinking about all these questions and grappling with them made me realize that queer ethnography can't operate in these kind of black and white schemes, but it allows kind of things to happen. It requires for things to happen, but at the same time to constantly reflect on what is happening, what the significance, the meaning, the impact of that is, and to avoid situations in which either my participants or myself uncomfortable or feel disrespected. So it was those experiences of a very different kind of fieldwork process and very different kind of interactions with my participants in Kenya compared to my earlier research in Zambia, that made me think around a whole different approach to doing fieldwork through relationships, through friendships that are embodied and in which desire plays a role in difficult ways, in complex ways, in positive and in negative ways, but at least to kind of acknowledge that complexity and to really think about that, what that means.
Hi, Adriaan. I'm so sorry. For some reason, my laptop was the worst now and it gave in. I need to just access those questions again. But thank you for sharing. I'm back. I promise I won't go anywhere.
Can I just say, Adriaan was absolutely, he just kept answering your last question that you answered, so you can just go to your next question.
Perfect.
So it was seamless. I was ready to go and step in to channel Ashwin, but I'm really glad you don't have to do that. So
I'm glad to be back.
Isn't it just like fate? Because I was preparing myself for, in the event something like this happens. But fortunately, we could save the day together, and the queer spirit is on our side. Thank you so much for that, because you wrote with so much sensitivity and so much, truly you humanized your experiences and others' narratives in very profound ways that I really enjoyed. I keep on saying it was a joy to read your text. Of course, it is a joy. It's a joy in this sense that it's beautiful to capture the way you captured the experiences in such beautiful language. However, I was convinced, I was aware as a South African, of the immense vulnerability with which the Kenyan research participants shared their lives with you. And you've done it in such a brilliant way. So I'm really grateful. And in that way, it was both a joy and also it was quite inspiring and also motivated me to be particular about the fact that I can experience some form of freedom in South Africa. So throughout the book, I find it interesting to encounter the struggle between private and public. In a sense, the private lives of queer people are foregrounded in the public precisely because of queerphobia, homophobia, transphobia, and the notion of queerness as being somewhat of a taboo. Could you speak to this private-public binary that queerphobia, homophobia, transphobia indirectly destabilizes?
The public-private binary, that's a really insightful observation. And you might be right indeed that I don't think I have any kind of in-depth discussion about that binary as such, but it is a theme that indeed I think runs kind of throughout the book and keeps coming up. So it's a really good observation. I wonder whether, so your suggestion or your question is whether, so how queerphobia kind of destabilizes that binary. I wonder whether the situation might actually be even more complex, because it's not only queerphobia, but it's also queerness itself that kind of destabilizes that binary, I think. And I think, and I've been working on issues of sexuality, and especially the controversy around homosexuality and LGBT rights, etc., for quite a number of years, both in Zambia and more recently in Kenya. I wonder whether much of the controversy that we see around queer sexuality in those countries and in other parts of Africa, whether it has to do with conflicting understandings of sexuality more generally in modern times. So, I mean, Michel Foucault wrote his history of sexuality in kind of late modern Europe, and I'm not in a position to write a history of sexuality in Africa at all, but I do wonder. So I do think that, I mean, Foucault's argument, of course, is that from the late 19th and in the 20th century, in Western culture, we have come to think about sexuality as an orientation and related to that an identity, and then as the basis, more recently, as the basis to claim rights. And it has something to be open about, and as something to express freely. And of course, that is what the whole culture of coming out is about. You need to, your sexuality is something to come out about, to disclose, to state publicly. And contemporary lesbian and gay activism both in Europe and in America, but also in many parts of Africa, has benefited from that kind of model, because it has used that way of thinking about sexuality as a basis to claim space. But in African context, I think that this idea of sexuality as something that is public conflicts with indigenous notions of sexuality, with the historic cultures of sexuality, in which queer expressions often could be tolerated in the community as long as they remained relatively invisible. And of course, there are kind of exceptions to that rule, because during rites of passage and in certain forms of indigenous religious practices, same-sex practices were kind of acceptable and were visible. But in general, forms of queerness were kind of allowed in the margins of society, in the margins of the community, when it wasn't too visible for the community.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether what we see today is a kind of clash between what Mark Aprecht calls the culture of discretion that surrounds sexuality traditionally, and kind of modern ideas about sexuality as something public, as something, as an identity, as something that needs to be publicly performed and publicly claimed. And these public forms of queerness then, of course, incite counter responses from conservative forces who want to purify public space again in a kind of heteronormative model. So the public-private binary that you were alluding to in your question has been destabilized for a long time, from colonialism, from Christian mission, from modernity, and the current clashes around homosexuality are only another kind of phase in that unfolding kind of dynamic. So I don't think there are any easy solutions to address that problem. Cultures are changing, and cultural change is a difficult process and comes with clashes and with conflicts. And I think that is what kind of can be observed in Kenya and in other parts of the continent.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, throughout the book, of course, you said that it wasn't discussed in depth, but I did pick up you quite critically about how we should think about Africa in relation to Western society, and how we should start developing our own epistemologies or ways of reflecting about our position. And I found that rather helpful, especially given my own research, and then this notion of the public is very contestable in our time, I think. So thank you for that. in your chapter on the Cosmopolitan Affirming Church, a denomination that celebrates sexual and gender diversity, you note the presence of homonormativity on the part of gay men. So what are your thoughts? What thoughts would you like to share with students preparing themselves for ministry and the creation of a affirming church? I think often about this. I'm not sure if you're aware of a few years ago, the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa decided to affirm LGBTI plus people and also to ordain queer folk. And then there was much contestation that happened, but very often it became a very reduced conversation about the presence of gay men. As a gay man, I'm asking this question as a gay man in the United Reformed Church, where the conversation really soon becomes about can gay men become ministers? So what do you have to say about the presence of a form of homonormativity in the CAC?
Oh gosh. Yeah, so homonormativity so CAC is I could say many wonderful things. It's a wonderful community. So let me just say, begin by acknowledging that before making some critical points. Cosmopolitan Affirming Church is the first, as far as I know, the first kind of LGBT church in Kenya and perhaps in East Africa, and is really kind of carving out a welcoming and inclusive and a radical theological space for the queer community in Kenya. And it has become an important hub for LGBT and queer activism in East Africa, and they are just doing amazing work. And it has been a real privilege to be part of the community, to follow them, to worship with them, and to really kind of experience their spirituality and their theology in a very kind of embodied way over the past 5 or 6 years. But you are right, in the chapter that I write about CAC in my book, as a good academic, I had to make some critical points as well, rather than just kind of give a very kind of positive. I give a very positive account, I think, overall. But so one of the critical kind of observations that I make is indeed about the workings of homonormativity in the church. And I think homonormativity manifests itself both in CAC and in the Kenyan queer community more generally in a couple of ways. One is indeed, and that seems to link to the point you made about the Dutch Reformed Church, is about how when we talk about LGBT communities, how gay men always tend to position themselves in the most kind of dominant position, and how they always risk to kind of dominate the discussion. And of course, that's also a self-reflexive comment, because I might be at risk for the same dynamic as well. So homonormativity works in the sense that it kind of privileges gay men and marginalizes other LGBT and queer perspectives and voices, in particular lesbian women, transgender people, bisexual people, etc. But there might be other ways in which homonormativity works. One, I think, in relation to gender performance. And I noticed, both in CAC and in the Kenyan community more generally, that so-called effeminate gay men were seen as kind of inferior to masculine-presenting gay men. So even within the group of gay men, there was a kind of hierarchy between effeminate and masculine performing men. And somewhat related to that kind of gender performance, there was also a kind of dichotomy of sexual roles, where the gay men who perform the active role in bed, who call themselves or consider themselves tops, are seen as more masculine and as more of a higher status than the bottoms, who are seen as playing the receptive or the female role or the passive role in sexual relationships. So there is a kind of economy of gender and sexuality in the gay community. Not only in Kenya, actually, because I see exactly the same dynamics playing out here in the UK. So it's not a unique Kenyan issue at all. But there is a kind of hierarchy in which cisgender, masculine presenting, and sexually dominant men kind of are on top of the hierarchy, while transgender, effeminate, and bottom gay men are kind of are at lower levels of the hierarchy. And of course, that these masculine presenting gay men also have a higher status in society more generally, because they can potentially pass as straight, so they are not necessarily read as gay. So they benefit in that sense from a heteronormative kind of privilege. So, in response to the question that you asked about my advice for students who are preparing for ministry, I don't know whether I've got any specific advice, but I think it is vital for us as scholars and also as clergy. I'm not a clergy person myself, but to unpack these ideologies of gender and sexuality that kind of underlie those dynamics and those assumptions about gender and sexuality. And I mean, if I would have to make a theological point, I would say that if we believe that in Christ there is no male and female, but that these kind of binaries are dissolved, then I mean that would be my starting point for a queer anthropology. But you are the systematic theologian, Adriaan, so you may have further developed ideas about that. But I think that kind of theological notion creates a theological space where we can question and interrogate those kind of binaries, not just between gay and straight and between men and women, but also within the gay community, between tops and bottoms and passive and active and et cetera, et cetera. So to really kind of challenge the categories and the kind of power, the hierarchy that comes with them.
That is profound. That is quite profound. Because in a sense, I'm always somewhat disturbed by this when I come out to people, straight people now. The first question to me is, are you the man or the woman in the relationship? And then of course, I find it absurd because the reason I'm gay is to not be with a woman. So this imposed binaries, and we sometimes sustain them within or maintain them within our own communities, and we're not truly doing the queering work that we intend to. So that was very helpful. Throughout the text, you relied greatly on the arts. In fact, in chapter 2, you interpret the song Same Love, or the remix, as a theological text. Now, this is one of the links that I sent in the chat room. So what are your thoughts on how queer theologians, and indeed queer people more broadly, treat cultural products as theological informants?
Yeah, so one of the things I really enjoyed in the process of researching and writing this book was that it allowed me to engage with a wide variety of arts. In the subtitle of the book, it has the notion of arts of resistance, and which is a really interesting concept, and it's kind of captures my interest in how, LGBT activists in Kenya engage in a wide range of different forms of activist methods and strategies. And of course, many organizations use the kind of more or less conventional strategies for community mobilization, legal advocacy, HRV and sexual health campaigns, etc., etc. But for the purpose of this book, I wasn't interested in these kind of more conventional activist methods, but in the use of arts and creativity, really, through which LGBT and queer actors were kind of claiming public space and public visibility. So I engage. For those of you who haven't read the book yet, I engage with the work of the literary writer Binyavanga Wainaina, who came out as gay a couple of years ago, and who unfortunately passed away last year. I discussed the Same Love video that you just mentioned, which is a hip-hop music video produced by a Kenyan music group, and that was released in 2016. I discussed the Story of Our Lives project, which was a project by a Kenyan arts collective where they collected the life stories of 250 LGBT Kenyans in different parts of the country. So I'm interested in the kind of the arts of storytelling and the arts of telling life stories, because life stories itself are so creative and are so rich and are so artistic. And then in the fourth case study of Cosmopolitan Affirming Church, I kind of read the practices of preaching and worship and of singing and of prophecy as a creative and artistic expression. And I think, and that might relate to your question about the significance of arts. Often when we talk about arts in African contexts, the focus tends to be on traditional arts. And then we think of masks and traditional dances and traditional costumes, etc. And don't get me wrong, that's a fascinating area of study. But I mean, to be honest, most of the people I was working with in Kenya, they have never been involved in traditional dances. They have never put on traditional costumes. So it's not their art, it's not their culture, so to say. And in other cases, the focus on art tends to be about kind of elitist art, like film and theater. Well, what I tried to do in the book was to kind of adopt a much broader notion of arts as embedded in popular culture at grassroots communities, and to really think about creativity, creative expressions as a form of grassroots art. And then, as I started working through these different case studies, I realized that through this very broad notion of arts, actually each of my interlocutors, each of my key figures, actually engaged in theology. And so Binyamanga Wainaina, who was baptized in church, but who later in his life definitely didn't identify as Christian, but in some of his texts, he didn't only criticize the church for its homophobia, but actually he invoked, in his own words, the Jesus of Martin Luther King and James Baldwin, so the kind of black prophetic Jesus from the African American church. And he invokes the legacy of the black Jesus, of the radical Jesus, as a way to critique the church, which is a way of thinking theologically. The same Love video that you mentioned and that you have just shared, thanks for that, ends with a Bible quotation, 1 Corinthians 13. And it concludes with the statement, love is God and God is love, which again is a theological statement in a video. In many of the life stories that people told in the Stories of Our Lives project, the storytellers weave Bible stories into their life stories. So while telling their life stories, they suddenly refer to biblical figures and they identify with them and with their experiences. Or they include references to God or to Jesus Christ in a way to kind of to critique institutional religion, which is another way of doing theology in a kind of narrative form. So I think with this focus on the arts, and with Christianity being such an important part of public culture, of popular culture in a country such as Kenya, artistic productions provide an incredible stepping stone towards theology. And actually not just a stepping stone, they are pieces of theology in their own right. Let me get that right. So much of the debate around inculturation in African theology tends to center on traditional culture, on indigenous traditions. And of course, that's really important. But I think the whole debate around inculturation would become much more fascinating when it actually would engage with contemporary arts and with popular culture as it is lived by current generations today. So I think there's an enormous potential basically in engaging with the arts in the broad sense of the word.
Thank you. That was, I absolutely loved it. Yeah, I absolutely loved the song. I absolutely loved, because right about the time when the original, I can't remember the name now, but Lambert, when Macklemore's version came out, I was still in high school and I was still making sense of my own sexuality. And that was right around the time when I came out. So hearing this again, so many years later, the songs rework, the remix version, it was absolutely amazing. Part of the process of your researching and writing this monograph was coming to terms with contracting HIV. How has this affected your recent and your forthcoming scholarship about the stigma concerning HIV and AIDS? Also, can I commend your courage to share your truth. I was so happy because I sometimes think we don't spend enough time in our church communities, our faith communities, talking about HIV and AIDS. So your courage is commendable. So how will this impact your research on the stigma?
Thank you, Adriaan, for raising that question. One of the things that I realized, I mean, it's a year ago that my book was published. It has been out exactly a year now. And my decision to write about my own HIV status was, of course, a deliberate one. I could have left it out, but I decided to include it. But one of the things that I've realized in the past year is that I decided to include it, but many people seem to be kind of uncomfortable with raising it. So even though I took the liberty to disclose it, it still seems that people feel a boundary to kind of discuss it, and which itself, I think, is an indication of the stigma that still surrounds and the silence that still surrounds HIV. So I was diagnosed with HIV in the middle of the process of writing and researching this book. And obviously that was a kind of, it was a kind of a moment of crisis in my own life, and I had to come to terms with it personally, for myself. And to be honest, I was at Theology at that time, and I was supposed to be writing my book, writing another chapter of my book, and I was facing a kind of writer's block because the news was still very fresh and I was still coming to terms with it. And I was working on the case study about stories of our lives in my book, which, as I just mentioned, is this collection of LGBT life stories from Kenya. And I was at Theology at that time, together with Stella Nyanzi. She was a fellow at the Institute at the same time. And Stella, for those of you who are less familiar with kind of queer studies in Africa, Stella is a truly amazing trailblazer, queer activist, feminist activist and scholar from Uganda. So I was enormously privileged to have a chance to spend a month with her at Theology. But it was the same month that I was back at Theology. The diagnosis with HIV was very fresh. I was still coming to terms with it, and I was basically facing that writer's block. And I still remember a conversation that I had with Stella in actually the last week that I was at Theology. And she made one comment that stuck to my mind. And she said, Adriaan, you can't be writing about the stories of their lives without including the story of your life. Wow. And she said, do whatever you think you need to do with it. But I think that's the problem. That's the reason why you are facing this writer's block. 2 days later, I was on the plane back from Cape Town to Amsterdam. I couldn't sleep. It was a night flight. I couldn't sleep. And that comment from Stella was kind of stuck to my mind, and I was kind of contemplating it. And that's when I suddenly realized what I had to do to overcome my own writer's block. And that was to include my own story. And that motivated me to include the interludes that we talked about earlier, the kind of 4 very personal autobiographic and autoethnographical reflections that come in between the main chapters of the book. And in one of these interludes, I write about my own experiences with HIV. So your question was about how that kind of shapes my work, my scholarship, right? And I think the decision to write about it has been incredibly liberating, because both personally and academic and intellectually. It allowed me to make sense of my own biography, my own academic biography, because Julie, in her introduction, mentioned to me being a visiting student at UKZN while I was a master's student at Utrecht, and which was in 2006. And at that time, I was actually a visiting student in the Theology and HIV program at UKZN. So it was my kind of first exposure to not just to theological thinking about HIV, but also to the realities of HIV in KwaZulu-Natal, which at that time in 2006 was really right in your face. And I ended up writing my master's dissertation at UKZN about African feminist theologies and stigma and gender around HIV. And there I was 10, 12 years later, actually back in South Africa and being faced with that topic myself again, but in a very personal way. So it kind of made my academic biography, it linked me back to the beginning of my academic journey. My first ever academic article was published in a South African theological journal, Missionalia, about theology and HIV/AIDS. So it was really kind of profound that I could make that connection. But also, it was liberating in relation to my research participants, because it challenged me to acknowledge the kind of vulnerable embodiment that I share with my participants, which I could use as a basis for my ethnographic writing and my ethnographic methodology. So it was really encouraging, actually, that after I had come out publicly about my own HIV status, that one of my research participants in Kenya contacted me next time that I was in Kenya, and he said, Adriaan, I want to meet because I want to tell you something. So he had seen my kind of public disclosure, and then he felt able to kind of share his own story about living with HIV. And I'm incredibly grateful that we were able to include him and his story about his HIV status in the documentary film that was mentioned at the beginning. So being open about my own situation provided a basis of rapport with my research participants, and it enabled to have conversations about issues that previously were not possible. And I think politically and theologically, coming to terms with my own HIV status and disclosing it has kind of allowed me to reclaim my own body as a site of politics, as a site of knowledge, and to kind of overcome the stigmatization that comes with being HIV positive, and to be rather confident, I think, in kind of being, I mean, I'm not proud of being HIV positive, but I'm proud of the courage that I was able to bring up, thanks to the support of many friends, to kind of be open about it. So I think in that sense, it has changed my writing, it has changed my teaching, my interactions with my own students, and my scholarship, because it has helped me to reconcile my body and my mind, and to develop a kind of whole sense of me as a human being rather than as just an academic.
Thank you so much for your courage and for telling your truth. My final question: your engagement with African and queer theologies is, in a sense, given your positionality as an outsider, though we should, of course, I think that we should both destabilize and deconstruct even the very idea of this notion of outsider. Given my research focus and the gender units commitments, what are your thoughts on the future of queer theology in Africa? No pressure. You might just set the stage for my whole PhD, but no pressure.
I mean, I will be really interested to hear your thoughts about that question, Ashwin. And I know that you and many others are doing some really, really exciting and trailblazing work in that regard. I mean, I agree with you that this whole idea of being an outsider and insider is one of the other kind of binaries that we need to interrogate. And I try to do that in my book by kind of making a much more giving a much more complex account of being an insider and an outsider at the same time in different ways. And yeah, so anyway, so there's a lot to say about that. But your question, of course, is a fair one. I think in my book, I try to avoid doing African queer theology myself, because I don't feel I'm to be in a position to do that. But what I do try to do, and is reading African queer texts through a theological lens and try to identify the theological moments in these texts. So somehow that creates a kind of a reconstruction of an African queer theology as I did encounter it in my kind of empirical material, in the life stories, in the artistic texts that I encountered in Kenya. So I think in my book, I identify a couple of what I call stepping stones towards an African queer theology. And partly that is about identifying, for example, the commonalities between African women's theology and the potential for queer theology. So to give one example, I engage quite in depth with Mercy Odioye's work. In particular, her text about where she reflects about her own experience as a childless woman in West Africa, and where she kind of questions this preoccupation with biological reproduction that kind of burdens women and comes with all the expectations of womanhood. And so basically my argument there is that Odioye's critique of the emphasis on biological reproduction and her reflections on alternative ways of thinking about humans being fruitful opens up an avenue, not just for feminist theology, but for queer theology, because it allows us to think about fruitfulness beyond biological procreation, which is a queer concern as much as it is a feminist concern. So, and then methodologically speaking, I was inspired by the work of African women theologians, in particular around storytelling, for example, and the use of storytelling, including autobiographical storytelling, as a theological method, adopting stories as a source of theology. And that's what I do, for example, in the chapter about stories of our lives, where I read these Kenyan LGBT life stories through a theological lens and as theological texts. So in these ways, I kind of try to identify stepping stones that I hope students in African theology and African queer theology, etc., will kind of they'll be able to kind of build on and expand on and do their own kind of creative and original and innovative work. And I know that there's a whole generation of up-and-coming scholars at Stellenbosch, at UKZN, at UWC, and at other institutions, both in South Africa and in other parts of the continent, that are ready to go ahead and to kind of continue and expand on that work. And I'm just excited to see what is coming out of that, and what kind of, to use Odioye's word, what kind of fruits will be coming out of that.
Thank you so much.
The task is yours.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful listening to, because you do read it from a certain vantage point, and I've become so aware of the important work to be done, not only in South Africa but in Africa as a whole, by queer people, and the important work on focusing on religion and the important role that religion plays in the lives of queer folks. So this is great news for me, and I guess the floor is open for some questions, and you are more than welcome to turn on your camera, or you may raise the question in the chat. I think I see Christoph has left us, but you folks, you are more than welcome to join us and raise your lovely questions. Jacob Meyrang, you are welcome to go ahead.
Hi, sorry, Adriaan, just have to move. Hi, hello, Adriaan.
So the last. So good seeing you.
Yeah, I try to pop in whenever I can. I think the last time I saw you was at the Tutu Foundation, when you were here with Sarojini Nada, and you were singing and dancing, if I could remember correctly.
We were.
Adriaan and I were actually involved in a singing and dancing contest.
Ah, wonderful. So I'm also now working here at the foundation, so that was a big change. But I just wanted, so what you said, in terms of your participatory approach to research, reminded me very much of what I wrote at some stage, that the embodiment, our own embodiment, is reflected in our theologies, and we can't bypass that. So thank you for raising that. I'm just curious, what next? That's basically my question. Where do you go from here now?
I'm always a bit scared for that question to come up, but let me buy myself a bit of time and say, Jacob, it's really wonderful to see you here. And I think the first time that we met was actually years ago in Stellenbosch, when, if I remember correctly. Sorry?
It was in Utrecht.
It was in Utrecht, at least, at the Society of Queer Theologians in the Netherlands.
That was,
I remember.
Yeah.
And then I think we met again at Stellenbosch when I gave a talk at the Faculty of Theology.
And at AAR as well.
Yeah. So what next? Currently, after finishing the book, I've been working on a documentary film that was mentioned, and I have been doing a project with LGBT refugees from Uganda who are based in Kenya and who I got to know during my research in Kenya over the past 5-6 years. And in this particular project, we have been kind of building on the kind of life story methodology, where we used life stories and Bible stories and brought them into conversation with each other. And in a very creative way, actually, because we did kind of contextual Bible study around specific Bible studies, inviting the refugees to kind of link the Bible stories to in relation to their own life experiences and to read themselves into the text, and then to develop a piece of community-based theater where they would, or drama, where they would kind of play out the retelling of the story in a contemporary context. So that has been a wonderful project, partly because the group we are working with, this community of LGBT refugees, is just, I mean, they are in a really difficult situation, but their courage and their strength and their creativity and their boldness is really, really impressive. And of course, their stories are really impressive. So that's something I'm currently working on. And in the meantime, I'm thinking about the kind of longer term future for my research, etc. I haven't yet decided what kind of specific direction I'm going to take, but I think I will pursue ways of maintaining my interest in the arts, in the way that I talked about it earlier, kind of the broad definition of arts as a form of imagining alternative forms of Christianity in Africa. So much of the work about Christianity in Africa is about specific forms of Christianity, mostly Pentecostalism, but also kind of other forms of Christianity that tend to be kind of associated with conservative politics. And I'm interested how the arts enable a space for alternative ways of imagining Christianity.
Okay, thanks, Adriaan.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thanks, Fred.
Dion, you had your hand raised.
Yes, thanks very much. And Adriaan, thanks again for being available this afternoon, and of course for the wonderful work that you've done, and congratulations on the book. I've seen it getting such a tremendous reception, and we're so grateful for this opportunity. And I can say I also remember one day running into you in the mall at the station at Utrecht, and so that seems to be where we meet one another. And once also in a hotel lobby, I think it was in Denver, or at the AAR, I remember we ran into one another there. Adriaan, the thing that I've been thinking about as you've been talking about this is the intersection between religion and politics in many African contexts. You know, a lot of my recent work has been deconstructing the sort of postmodern imposition of a public-private divide that comes from westernized views of the relationship between religion as a sort of privatized aspect of life and the political as public. And as you know, in Africa, we don't, South Africa is slightly different, but in many parts of Africa, that kind of public-private binary doesn't exist. We tend to operate in the post-colony rather than in post-modernity in that sense. And religion plays quite an important role in the structuring of political systems. So in Uganda, for example, you know, what is permissible for one to do with one's body, the choices one makes sexually are deeply influenced by religious communities. I'd just love to hear, you know, some of your thoughts on how, as particularly those of us who operate in the contested sphere of public theologies, might think a little more carefully in Africa around the intersections of faith and public life, and particularly political formation for justice.
Thank you, Dion. That's a really fascinating question. In addition, by the way, to our very brief encounter at the Utrecht train station and the hotel lobby in Denver, I also have very good memories of a wonderful lunch you treated me to at Stellenbosch just a few years ago. So I look forward to the moment that we can do that again when this COVID thing is over.
Yeah. Please come back as soon as you can. The wine is cheap.
But yeah, you are obviously right, of course, that this whole distinction, or this distinction between public and private, between religion and politics, between church and state is deeply problematic and doesn't really work in most parts of Africa, if any parts of Africa. As I always remind my own students, it doesn't really work in many parts of Europe either. And I mean, the UK is the primary example of that, of course, which has an established church and where the Anglican bishops have seats in Parliament, etc. So there's much more to say. It's not a black and white thing about as if in Europe we have managed to kind of have a very strict and rigid distinction between the two. But I mean, you refer to Uganda. Most of my work has been on this issue specifically, has actually been on Zambia, which of course constitutionally is a Christian nation. And in many parts of Christian-dominated Africa, of course, in recent decades, we've seen the emergence of Pentecostal forms of Christianity, which have become much more explicit in the kind of political agendas and imposing their political vision onto the state and on the public sphere and policing that vision in many different ways. So public theology needs to be sensitive and needs to be critically aware of those workings of those kind of political theologies that are part of popular forms of Christianity and the way they are imposed onto the public sphere. At the same time, and maybe I've become a bit critical of the overemphasis on Pentecostalism in many parts of Africa, and the whole suggestion that Pentecostalism is all that exists when we talk about Christianity in Africa. I think that, and that is really important, I think, in response to your question about how we can be sensitive towards these issues. I think we need to acknowledge the plurality of Christianity in Africa. So even within Pentecostalism, actually, there is quite a wide range of opinions, of theological visions, of moral and ethical visions. So one of the things that has struck me recently in a project that I'm doing with religious leaders in East Africa around issues of sexuality is that actually some Pentecostal charismatic pastors have much more freedom compared to their Anglican and Catholic brothers and sisters to engage with issues of sexuality, because they don't have to fear the repercussions of the bishop or of the church as an institution. And they have much more freedom. When they tell their congregation that this is what God is telling them to do, then that is something that the congregation needs to take seriously. And there is no bishop in place that can dismiss them. So even Pentecostalism itself is already much more plural. But I do think that taking the plurality of Christianity into account, there is a multiplicity of different theological visions and political visions. And I think there is space to kind of explore the tensions and the conflict between these different visions of theological and political visions of Christianity that create a space for theologians, for clergy, for activists to extrapolate. And that is basically what someone like Binyavanga Wainaina was trying to do when he referred to the Black Jesus of Martin Luther King, invoking the history and the legacy of the civil rights movement and an authority like Martin Luther King to kind of critique popular forms of Christianity and to carve out a different way of thinking about Christianity as a kind of political vision.
Yeah, Adriaan, thanks so much. And I just want to make mention and honor one of our prospective PhD students who is also a part of the cohort for Julie's Gender, Religion and Health, Tebogo Sawapa, who wrote a really excellent master's thesis on the Grace Bible Church in South Africa. And Tebogo is a very unique person in that he's an advocate at the bar, so he's qualified as a lawyer, and he completed his master's in theology and will now do a PhD. And so your work is particularly valuable to him, and thanks for that. So I hope you'll hear his name in the future as well.
I'll keep an eye on that and look forward to engaging with his work.
Thank you.
Friends, are there any more questions? Feel free to raise your hand or drop one in the chat function. Okay, I'll just give another few seconds for those that are furiously typing.
I'm happy to engage with any questions that you might have, either at this occasion or feel free to drop me an email after this session.
Yeah, perhaps you could just share your contact details. I think you have a website, if I'm not mistaken.
Sorry?
I think you might have a website, if I'm not mistaken.
I have, yeah. So basically, if you Google my name, then my website at the University of Leeds comes up, and you'll find my email address. I should be able to write it right now, right? Which might be more straightforward.
Not a problem. While Adriaan is typing, I would just like to again thank Professor Claessens, Marita, Prof. Dion. Thank you for hosting this wonderful gathering. And thank you all for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure. I experienced it to be quite a wholesome conversation and quite enriching. I've learned so much. It's unlocked so many new questions in my mind. I will definitely be returning to the book. And please reach out to Marita on how to get a copy of this very, very important book. Adriaan, thank you so much for your time, for allowing yourself to be present in this space in this fashion. It has been a joy.
The joy has been more than 100% mine. So thank you so much, Ashwin, for being such a, not only a critical, but also a very sympathetic reader of my book and a very generous reader. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. So this is the end, folks. Keep well, enjoy the day. Prof. Claessens, I'm listening. We're listening.
Thank you, and I will stop the recording now. So thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you so much, friends. Enjoy the rest of
your day. Thank you, Adriaan.
Keep well.
Thanks, everybody. Bye then. Bye, Adriaan.